Hi, Elaine. Hi, Kathy.
Hello.
So the two of you have been coming up with a way of working with trauma that's not necessarily a standard way of doing it, even though it has many sources in SE and others. Do you want to describe a little bit what you do?
Well, I'm going to step in and do a little bit of an introduction because really this is Elaine's creativity and her own experience as an acupuncturist that brought this different perspective. I met her through the somatic experiencing trainings, and on the surface it would look like what we were doing with this more biophysiological neuroscience approach would be really different than a traditional therapy like Asian medicine. But as Alaine and I got to know each other better, and she was doing consultations with me about her clients, it became apparent that there was this beautiful overlap between the two systems. And that's what she's so incredibly articulate at expressing. So Alaine, I would turn it over to you to carry on from there to talk about yourself. How wonderful you are at creating this perspective.
Well, I think when I started studying the somatic experiencing back in 2003 or 4, I was really taken, in the very beginnings of it, that when you look at sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, that in my language, you're looking at yin and yang. And when you're looking at restoring regulation and balance to a person's body, that's really foundational premise of acupuncture and Asian medicine is harmony and balance between opposing opposites, but within dualities. And
so, Elaine, if you don't mind, maybe we can slow down a little bit because for people who are not that familiar with it, it might be just words. And I think that, there's something very beautiful about talking about, the balance of opposing forces, what energy means, what chi, give a little bit of a context of that so that people can see how, it might be talking about the same thing from two different languages.
Yes, thank you. So, 4,000 years ago, the Taoists, the philosophical scholars, were guiding the ancient Asian people living in an agricultural society about the nature of life, how to live, and how to find health. And what they said was that all of life emerges out of one primal source. So we're all connected. Animals, people, plants, all of life is connected. And that life presents itself in dualities. There's male and female, there's day and night, there's summer and winter, there's more finer way of thinking, there's inhale and exhale, heartbeat, heart rest. All these dualities are expressions of the movement of chi, of energy. Western science, Western neuroscience, says we have a sympathetic nervous system, which is about mobilizing activity, which is a more yang expression, and a parasympathetic nervous system, which is more about resting and digesting. And that life happens similarly between these two opposing poles. So when we bring Chinese medicine into this conversation, we can see that sympathetic and parasympathetic are actually connected to each other, just like day is connected to night or warmth is connected to cold. We can't have one without the other. And that when we have those two poles in a dynamic tension with each other, where one isn't dominating the other, that then we have harmony and balance and we have health. So that's kind of our foundational premise, that we want to help restore harmony and balance, and we want to use these forces that exist in nature to help facilitate balance and regulation in people who've experienced an overwhelm that's disturbed that sense of balance.
So what it is we're talking about a model where there is inherently a balance of different forces, and that there's an equilibrium, and the balance is in being in that balance of the two systems, as opposed to something that is static.
Exactly.
So that we have a model that's about finding the balance as opposed to just finding the stable place.
Exactly. Finding the dynamic tension.
Yeah.
And what acupuncturists find, what I have found or in 30 years of practice, is that many of the people who come to acupuncturists have a traumatic stress response somewhere in their background. That the kinds of things that, kinds of health problems that come out of a traumatic stress experience, like autoimmune illness or metabolic disturbance, irritable bowel, chronic migraine headaches, things like that, insomnia. Those are the things that people come to acupuncturists for, because we are so good at, we are already orchestrating balance between opposing forces. It's in our inherent form of practice, even though most acupuncture schools do not teach anything about trauma or about neurophysiology. We're going to change that over the coming years, we hope, but so that people can know more and see more, because so many of these people are coming to acupuncturists, but acupuncturists don't necessarily understand the importance of what they're seeing, or what may be giving rise to what they're seeing.
Right, right. So that by training, even though they don't really focus on trauma or don't know much necessarily about trauma, acupuncturists have a focus on restoring the ability to balance.
Exactly.
And that is actually what helps dealing with the underlying causes of what affects people who have trauma.
Exactly.
And what I would add in is that we have this whole other category of symptoms related to trauma that our current care delivery system doesn't address very well, which are the somatic physical symptoms. We have the adverse childhood experience study that says there's a correlation between later development of disease and earlier trauma. But we haven't yet fully changed our care delivery. So we have a lot of people who have physical symptoms related to trauma. They may also have mental health symptoms, but they're having physical symptoms, and they don't have a place to go to know how to address those in a successful way, because the medical system is similar. People are not necessarily trained as a medical practitioner to recognize the symptoms of trauma. So those of us in the physical care world end up seeing many people who have symptoms that are actually symptoms of trauma that are manifesting through physical manifestation of symptoms.
Right.
And we have to kind of figure it out. And so part of this book is for acupuncturists and lay people to get a little bit more orientation about how some of the disruptions and the disequilibrium that comes from trauma shows up in our daily life, in our physical systems, so that we have a better orientation. Because we could say the same thing for physical care providers. We hope in the future there's more education about trauma for people who are delivering medical care and other forms of healthcare, because it's a missing piece overall.
Yeah. So you're pointing out that trauma then manifests in physical symptoms. But when you're talking about the physical healthcare providers, you're not talking about providing symptomatic relief.
Right. I mean, you can try to provide symptomatic relief, and I think, Alaine, you would speak to this as well. And often it's not very effective because the symptoms are arising from this lack of balance and equilibrium. And so they repeat again. You maybe get temporary treatment, or the treatment just doesn't work. Things like migraine, same list that Alaine gave. Many of the clients that would come to see me were coming with physical complaints, and they weren't getting good success in coming at it as a purely physical event that was unrelated to their history and the lack of equilibrium in their system behind the scenes, so to speak.
Yeah.
So I'd add one more piece too, that there's sort of in the broad swath of trauma survivors, there are some that come with a very braced body system, a more yang expression. They have tight muscles. They have a tight energy system. And if an acupuncturist puts a needle into that braced system, it's going to hurt more. And the system is so clamped down that the chi, the energy, can't really flow behind the impulse of the needle. Similarly, the other way that people show up is a very flaccid body system. Like they're very soft. They're kind of just don't have much tone. And if an acupuncturist places a needle in this kind of person, there isn't enough tone to carry the chi, to carry the energy. So incorporating some of the touch techniques that we described in the Tao of Trauma an acupuncturist can help a person move either towards regulation, towards that zone of comfort or zone of resiliency where the chi has a possibility to move. Either they're going to come down if they're too high, if they're too rigid, too much energy, or come up if they're flaccid and don't have adequate tone to carry the chi.
Yeah, so in that sense, there's an analogy with what we do in therapy is you can do therapy only if the client is in a certain space. Exactly. And you have to spend the time preparing it.
That's right.
Before just applying treatment.
Right. Just like a farmer has to plow the field before he plants the seed. We have to prepare our client to receive our ministrations.
Mm-hmm. So you're using the metaphor of the farmer plowing the field, and maybe that might be a good transition with talking about some of the correspondence between what we do in psychotherapy informed by neuroscience, Peter Levine's findings, and the model of the Asian and acupuncture model.
Sure. So Peter Levine studied animal predator-prey relationships and came up with this wonderful description of 5 stages that all animals go through in responding to threat. And he additionally said that human beings go through the same steps, and that if we're able to go through all those 5 steps, we're less likely to have symptoms or to carry an imprint of that traumatic experience. And if we are thwarted in one of those steps, that the route to healing is to help the person complete that step that's missing. And the symptoms that a person has will be maybe not directly dictated, but will be influenced by which step is missing for them. So the curious thing is that these 5 steps that he described and defined are actually mirrored in the 5 elements of Chinese medicine, that the Chinese understood these 5 phases as phases of the generation in the agricultural cycle. Mm-hmm. So I could go around and Peter Levine said the first step, I call it awakening arousal. He calls it arrest. That it's a task of living to notice that there's something new in our environment. We need to have the sensory apparatus, the interoceptive capacity to notice that there's something new. If we don't have that, we're going to trip and fall on the blocks on the floor of the living room. We need that as a capacity. The second step to signal threat. So we need to be able to recognize danger as well as safety, and we need to be able to seek out help from others in order to cope with life. This is that first step, awakening arousal, belongs to the metal element. The second step belongs to the water element. Its organs include the kidney, with the adrenal sitting right on top. Of course, Western science and Chinese medicine both recognize the importance of the kidney and the adrenal gland for initiating a sense of threat, secretion of adrenaline and other stress-related chemicals. Yeah. So that capacity to know when we're safe and when we're not. Then the next capacity, the wood element, is to mobilize a response. We need to be able to mobilize a response that's commensurate with the level of threat that we experienced. So this is the wood element belongs to the spring, the season spring, when all life starts to emerge, as we're experiencing now with more flowers and buds on the trees and all of that kind of thing. Then the next capacity is we need to restore coherence. We need to know that the threat is over. We need to know that we've survived and that it's over, which is a message that comes from our heart with the equilibrium of the heartbeat. Instead of being boom, 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 shock, danger, alarm, it comes back to regular, quiet heartbeat. We know we survived. That belongs to the fire element. And then the last element is the earth element, whose capacity is to help us digest the gristle, help us harvest the lessons in this experience. Because no matter how successful we've been at going through all of these steps, there's necessarily some gristle for us to have to process. And then we come back we round back around to the metal element, where we have a clean slate, relatively clean slate. We're able to notice something new in our environment again. and we're prepared to respond to a potential new threat. So these 5 steps reflect the process of planting, growth, maturity, harvest, and decline that's in the agricultural cycle, and is that expression of the Tao, is that expression of creation that came at the very beginning of time. Every organization begins as a thought, and then we take some actions to make it happen, and it matures, and it gives its gifts, it harvests its lessons, and then it declines. Every spring has to come after winter and before summer. It can't come at any other time of year. These seasons come in a particular order. The threat response happens in a particular order. Life happens in a particular order. We're born, we mature, we reproduce, we give our gifts, we die. It's the order of life.
Yeah,
and
I want to just add a little footnote because you mentioned the seasons, and there are 5, and so the footnote is that in the Chinese system there is a 5th season, which is the late summer. And so when you have that 5 elements, that's we're referring to that 5th season that's not in our calendar, but that I personally find very inspiring to relate this not just to trauma, but just to a normal cycle of life, in which one season precedes another one and follows one and precedes another one, and where this is the normal course of things, and there is kind of a recurring. It's part of a cycle. It's not something that's a one-time thing. So it's kind of a larger context, which is about life itself, and not just an exceptionality of trauma.
Exactly right. Exactly right. I mean, the Taoists teach us that health comes with living in harmony with the gifts and challenges of the seasons. Don't fight what's happening right now. So right now it's spring, and spring is the time to see a new future. It's a time of new beginnings. It's a time of visioning, creating a vision for the growing season. So it's associated with the eyes. The eyes are the sense organ that's associated with the wood element and the spring, because it's important to see where we're going and to see what our future is. So it's not just the tangible seeing, I need to turn right at the street up ahead. It's also seeing where your life is going. And so it's a great time for contemplating, what future am I trying to create for myself? Nature will support you exploring, what's my destiny? Where am I going with my life? And what steps do I need to take in order to manifest my true nature?
And I think if we look from the somatic experiencing perspective of that threat response cycle, in effect, that's what's being said in that, is when you don't do things in that order, that is the natural order, that would then inherently produce a kind of a return to equilibrium, because every natural step has been completed in whatever form, successful, halfway successful, but nevertheless you come to a completion. When that doesn't complete, when there's an interruption, then there's something in the system that gets disturbed, and that disturbance continues into the future. And you don't do the completion of the cycle. You have some element of that cycle that is continuing to act kind of out of the normal system and begins to create, whether that's physical symptoms or behavioral symptoms, there's now dynamics and pressures within the whole person that are no longer in good relationship. And if you have multiple versions of that over time, you start getting multiple directions of pulling kind of in the wrong way and not being ready for that next step. So Alaine, as you're talking about in spring, I know you have many clients that you can give examples of, but if you're going to give an example of someone where you're working in this context with the wood element, how would that sound? Because I think that would be helpful for people to see how that interruption then starts showing itself, because it's no longer embedded in the natural cycle. You see these sort of unnatural expressions of how that got interrupted.
Right.
Yeah. So I like also, Kathy, how you position the question to see, in a way, when we talk about interruption or something that's unfinished or something that's not completed, it may sound abstract, but so it would be very nice to see how it shows up so that we can recognize the concept in what we can observe.
Right. So if a mobilization response is thwarted, and that thwarted energy has a lid on it that's not allowing it to flow from the wood towards the fire, it's going to particularly influence the corresponding tissues and tasks of the wood element. So there's a whole resonance with the wood element, and I mentioned the eyes earlier, also the tendons and the ligaments, the blood, the quality of hopefulness, being able to see a future, all those things. So the story I'll tell you is a fellow who I was treating when I worked at the Veterans Administration, and he was first appointment, and I went to shake his hand, and he said, "I don't press flesh with women." And I said, "Okay, what's your name? Welcome." And he told me, and we walked down the hall, and he's kind of strutted with a very rigid body type and a lot of anger I could hear anger in his voice, which is the emotion associated with the wood element. And his jaw in particular was very tight, and you could see the bulging kind of muscles around his jaw, and he pointed at pain that went down the side of his leg, which he could draw the gallbladder meridian, which is the partner to the liver in the wood element, and talked about a lot of pain and everything's wrong and we got to my office, and he came in, and he noticed some flowers that were sitting on the window. And I could see his eyes kind of go towards the flowers. And I just noted, "I see you're noticing the flowers on my window." And he said, yeah, I used to garden with my grandfather, and "Oh, tell me about your grandfather." And so anyway, he began to soften as he remembered his grandfather and work in the garden. And I said, "Gosh, your face looks like it's a little bit softer. I wonder how that is for you." "Well, yeah. And I said, "So I wonder if you can remember," I think I said, "what percentage of you feels safe right now? Or is there a time you can remember feeling safe?" And he looked at me with these most profound eyes, the softest, biggest eyes. And he said, "Damn, no one has ever invited me to feel safe." So when you think about military service, they don't have the luxury to take time to feel safe. They need to feel vigilant in order to protect themselves in theater in particular. So there's no benefit to feeling safe. They need to feel aroused. They need to feel active and alert. So we put him on the table, and by this time his body was soft enough to receive a needle. I did a very, very simple treatment, just one point in his liver pathway, one point in his gallbladder pathway, and spent a little time holding his kidney adrenal system. At the end of this session, I asked him if he had one word to describe how he felt different, and he said, "Ebullient. I feel ebullient." And he got off the table, and he put his ankle over his knee to put his shoes on, and he said, "Damn, I haven't been able to do that since I got home from Iraq." So that the wood element and the association with the tendons and ligaments made his tendons and ligaments so tight that he couldn't bend his knee. But now he could bend his knee. And not only were his tendons and ligaments more flexible, so was his emotional state. Because when I walked him back up to the desk to make another appointment, he picked me up in his arms, planted a kiss on my cheek, and put me back down again. He's a really big guy, and I'm kind of small, and put me back down again. And after he left, the desk staff called me in and said, so what did you do with that guy?" But couple sweet needles and just the right interaction. And
Yeah. So do you want to add something to this, Kathy, to the comment on this example? Or
I think, this is this is the thing we in a way we started with. It's not only about trauma. You know, we can get so focused on trauma when we're treating trauma that we forget there's a bigger life that's happening that's also holding the trauma and expressing it in sort of day-to-day ways like this. And so sometimes we're in the trenches working so hard on the trauma, we forget that sometimes a very simple interaction can make a huge difference in how the person is feeling about themselves and expressing themselves. And maybe this guy still has a pretty serious trauma history that needs more work, and there's more work to do. But sometimes those kind of things where you see, you get that right aim, so to speak. And I think that this interface between looking at it from this more traditional perspective that holds in it that bigger framework of life and life pattern and the seasons and our bigger place in the world, and overlaps enough with the practicality of specific symptoms, it increases the probability that you get some of these kind of interactions, which are just, it's so delightful, because I've had similar versions with clients where that the bigger issues aren't gone, but they've touched a state that has given them hope, that has let them see that their life is not only organized around their trauma and around their symptoms. Maybe the next day he's feeling tight again or whatever, but even that momentary access to something different says that possibilities are available. And I think those are critical moments in the overall treatment with people, that we provide that access to that quality that gives hope. And Alaine, I'm assuming that's a piece of what happened with him, is that in a very short period of time, he perhaps shifted his idea of what was going to be possible in his recovery.
And I think the other thing that happened that you can see in that example is his wood energy that was quite congested. Actually, when it got a little more flexible and could move, it connected up to the fire energy. He was able to make connection and, in a playful connection with me, who he wouldn't even shake hands with.
Yeah. So that to give a little feedback on this, what I'm hearing also very much is how this model goes into the notion of that flow of from one state to the next. And so if you recognize the wood energy, it's not to say wood energy and static or something, but it's about allowing it to flow into what it would normally flow to.
Right.
And that's where you get that fire energy.
Right, where it's actually organically designed to flow to.
It's designed to, it's normal. It's just that sense of it's been blocked, and that allowing it to go where it would need to go organically. Right. And the other thing that strikes me is how, we talk about, figuratively, of pinpoint intervention, of going right to the point. And so here, what you're describing is by having a sense of what stage it is, and this is that stage of wood. And but it's also something where you have both, the stage the same way as using the Peter Levine stages, but you kind of connect it to a poetic quality. So that it has maybe a little less sense of dealing with a pathology, but with something that is, and you also connect it to organs based on the theory of the elements, right. And then can have that pinpoint intervention right there.
Right.
And notice what then happens when you touch there.
Right. So each of these 5 elements have corresponding organs, tissues, sense organ, spiritual quality, and so on. So whether you're a body worker or a mental health provider, the correspondences, this network of correspondences that the Chinese designed, can help guide if you know someone's having trouble with digesting their story. The story keeps going round and round, and they can't assimilate lessons, and they can't let it go and move into their colon and purge it out. You know that you need to work with their viscera, because that's what goes with the earth element, is the stomach and the spleen. Mm-hmm. You know that you need to help them with transformation, which is the task of the spleen. So once you've figured out where a person is primarily been thwarted or is primarily not having flow, then you can look at the corresponding correspondences and sort out how can you best serve this person. So it becomes a little more nuanced analysis of the person and more, more helpful interventions, I think.
Yeah. So is this okay to just kind of shift toward the conclusion of what we're doing here?
Yeah, the one thing I do want to add, which actually leads to the conclusion, is the other piece that goes with this is because of the sense of the cycle, it also helps keep the practitioner oriented. Because one of the things that can be confusing for people is they're working effectively with their clients, and then what seem to be new symptoms arise. But if you're looking at it in this natural cycle, you would see very often those symptoms are a natural expression of the next stage that they're going to. And so then you wouldn't be surprised if someone now is better able to mobilize response, that they then come into the mobilization of that. And that is going to be the natural follow-on of the completion, is that you will see them flow through these different parts of the threat response cycle. You will see them move through the sort of seasonal expressions in a pretty natural way. And you won't be as startled as the practitioner about what's happening and disoriented. So in a way, it helps you with a treatment plan of knowing what's likely to be coming next, so you're already anticipating it as you're doing your effective work with the earlier stages of it.
Yeah.
And you may not get as befuddled by new symptoms or many symptoms if you can hone in on which element is the primary focus for where this person got thwarted. And even though they have symptoms that belong all around the map, by keeping the goal of restoring coherence and core regulation, that then those other symptoms are going to fall by the wayside once you've restored core regulation for them, and you've got a bookmark for how to get there.
Fabulous.
Yeah, good. So is there something else you would want to add to this?
Not for me.